The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes wasn't the ceiling tiles or the IV stand or even the dull ache behind my left ear. It was the quiet. Not the quiet of a home in the early morning, but the particular quiet of a room where someone has just stopped speaking because they think you can't hear them. My daughter-in-law Megan was standing near the window with her phone pressed to her shoulder. My son, David, was in the chair by the door, looking at something on a tablet. Neither of them had noticed I was awake. I kept my eyes half closed, the way you do when you're not sure what you've walked into. At 71, you learn the difference between a conversation you're meant to hear and one you aren't. Megan said, "The realtor can come Thursday. We just need the signature by then." David said, "She won't understand what she's signing." That's kind of the point. That's when the room went quiet. Not because they stopped talking, but because something inside me stopped assuming things. Even the hum of the IV pump seemed louder than it had a moment before. I'm Eleanor. I live in Naperville, Illinois, in a brick colonial on Ellsworth Avenue that my husband Raymond and I bought in 1982. Raymond passed in 2019. Since then, I've lived alone, and I've lived well. I still drive. I still do my own taxes. I still read 2 newspapers in the morning, one of them on paper because I like the smell of it. 3 days before that hospital morning, I had fainted in my kitchen. A small stroke, the doctor said later. A warning, not a verdict. Recoverable. But those 3 days, it turned out, had given my son enough time to walk through doors I hadn't known were unlocked. I want to tell this the way it happened, not the way it felt. Feelings came later. What came first was information. I listened for another minute. Megan mentioned a power of attorney. David mentioned a buyer who was already interested. Megan said something about moving me to Sunrise Willow, which I knew was an assisted living facility off Route 59. Then a nurse came in with a blood pressure cuff, and I opened my eyes fully, and I smiled the way grandmothers are supposed to smile, and I said, "Good morning." David stood up quickly. Megan slipped the phone into her bag like she was putting away a receipt. "Mom, you're awake." "I am. How do you feel?" "Tired," I said. "A little foggy." That wasn't entirely true. But some people mistake silence for permission, and I wasn't ready to correct that mistake yet. The nurse's name was Priya. She was efficient in the way people are when they've been on shift for 10 hours and have 4 more to go. She asked me my name, the year, the president. I answered all 3 correctly. I caught the small look David exchanged with Megan across the bed, the kind of look I wasn't meant to see. "Your family has been very involved," Priya said. "Your son has been handling the paperwork." "What paperwork?" She hesitated, the way people do when they realize they may have said something they shouldn't have. "The admission forms. And I think there's something about a medical proxy. You can ask the social worker when she comes by." I said thank you. I asked for water. When she left, David sat on the edge of my bed and put his hand on mine, and I noticed it was the first time he'd touched me in probably a year. "Mum, we've been really worried. Megan and I have been handling everything so you don't have to stress." "That's kind of you. The house, the bills, everything. Don't worry about any of it." "What about the house?" He glanced at Megan, a quick look, almost nothing. "We can talk about that later. You should rest." At the time, I didn't think much of the phrase, "talk about that later." Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. Let me tell you about David, because context matters. 3 memories came back to me that afternoon, one after the other, the way memories sometimes do when the present knocks on an old door. The first was from 1994. David was 12. He'd broken a window playing baseball and blamed it on a neighbor's boy. Raymond made him apologize and pay for it with his allowance. I remember standing in the kitchen, wiping down the counter, and Raymond saying to me quietly, "He lies when he's scared. We have to watch that." The second was from 2008. David had borrowed $9,000 from us to cover what he called a gap in his mortgage. He never paid it back. When I mentioned it once, years later, he looked at me and said, "Mom, that was a gift. You know that." I didn't correct him. Raymond was sick by then, and I was tired. The third was from this past Christmas. Megan had been walking through my living room with a clipboard, and when I asked what she was doing, she said, "Just thinking about what furniture would go where. Someday." She laughed like it was a joke. I laughed too, but my hand on the coffee cup had gone still, and I hadn't known why at the time. 3 scenes. 3 small warnings I had filed away without reading. The present has a way of opening old envelopes. On the second day in the hospital, I asked for my phone. David said it had been left at the house. He'd bring it tomorrow. I asked for the landline number of my neighbour, Francis. He said he didn't have it memorized. Neither did I, which was the problem. My contacts were in the phone. I asked for a pen and the small notebook I always kept in my purse. Megan said my purse was at the house too, for safekeeping. I didn't push. I just nodded, and I closed my eyes, and I let them believe what they wanted to believe. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do is be what someone else has already decided you are. Around 4 in the afternoon, a woman named Denise came in with a folder. She said she was the hospital social worker and wanted to go over my discharge plan. David asked if he could sit in. Denise looked at me, and her pause was the kind that carries a question inside it. "Mrs. Halverson, would you like your son present for this conversation?" Here is where the first small thing happened. I said, "I'd like to speak with you alone, please." David's face did something. It was quick. Most people wouldn't have caught it, but I'd been watching that face for 46 years. He said, "Of course, Mom. I'll get some coffee." When he and Megan left, Denise closed the door and sat down in the chair he'd been sitting in. The chair was still warm. I remember noticing that. "Mrs. Halverson," she said, "I have some forms here that your son submitted. I need to confirm a few things with you directly before we proceed." She opened the folder. I saw the top of a document. The words, "Durable Power of Attorney," were printed across the header, and below that, a signature line with my name typed underneath it. The signature line was blank. "Did you sign this?" she asked. "No." She nodded slowly. The way someone nods when the answer lines up with something they'd already suspected, and made a small mark in the corner of the form with her pen. "Okay," she said. "Let's start over." Denise was in her 50s, with grey at her temples and the kind of patient voice that comes from years of sitting across from people in moments that matter. She explained, calmly, that the state required a power of attorney to be signed by the principal, that's me in the presence of a witness, and, for property matters, a notary. Without that, the document is not valid, it's just paper. She explained that the hospital had received the form yesterday from my son, along with a verbal request to initiate a discharge transfer to Sunrise Willow Assisted Living. She explained that because I was cognitively intact, according to my admitting physician's notes, and because the POA had not been properly executed, none of that was going to happen without my direct consent. I listened. I didn't interrupt. There's a kind of listening that people mistake for agreement, and I've learned to let them make that mistake when the stakes are still being drawn. Then I asked if I could make a phone call. She handed me the hospital phone and the number for directory assistance, and she left me alone for 10 minutes. I called my attorney, Martin Sheffield. Raymond and I had used him since 1991. He answered on the second ring. I told him where I was, what I'd heard, and what I'd just seen. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Eleanor, don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. I'll be there in an hour." I said, "Bring a notary," he said, "already planning to." While I waited for Martin, I did something that felt small at the time. I asked Denise if the hospital could print me a copy of the unsigned POA for my records. She said yes. She also printed the admission forms David had filled out and the discharge request. 3 documents. I folded them into the pocket of my hospital gown, and I felt, for the first time since waking up, like I had edges again. About 40 minutes later, David and Megan came back. Megan was holding a coffee cup, and David was carrying a small stack of what I recognized as my own personal mail from the house. He set it on the tray table like it was a gift. "Brought your mail, Mom. Thought you'd want to look through it." I glanced at the top envelope. It was from my bank. It had already been opened. I didn't mention it. I just thanked him and set the stack aside, because that wasn't the part that mattered yet. He sat down. "So, did the social worker tell you about Sunrise Willow?" "It's really nice. Megan and I toured it last week. There's a waiting list, but the director said they could fit you in by the end of the month. That was thoughtful. We just want you safe." No. Megan said, "The house is a lot, Eleanor. All those stairs, and the yard." "It is a lot," I agreed. David smiled. It was a small smile. He thought he was winning. Martin walked in at 5:47 p.m. Martin is 74 and wears the same style of grey suit he's worn since the Reagan administration. He is not a dramatic man. He sets things down carefully. He takes notes in pencil. He once told me that the loudest thing in any room is usually a calm voice with documentation. Behind him was a younger woman with a stamp and a ledger. The notary. David stood up. "Who are you?" "Martin Sheffield, Mrs. Halverson's attorney." "Mum, I didn't call a lawyer." "No," I said. "I did." The room went quiet again. This quiet was different. It had weight to it, the kind of silence that settles before something underneath it shifts. Martin set his briefcase on the chair. He pulled out 3 documents. He placed them on the tray table one by one. The first was a new, clean power of attorney, naming Martin himself as my agent, revocable at any time. The second was a revocation of any prior POA, including any that might be filed later. The third was a letter instructing my bank to flag any transaction on my accounts that had been initiated in the last 7 days. He read each one aloud, slowly, in the calm voice of a man who had read thousands of documents aloud in his life. The notary watched. I signed. She stamped. David said, "Mom, what are you doing?" I said, "Protecting my house." Megan said, "From who?" I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. After Martin left, David tried one more time. "Mom, you're confused. You've had a stroke." "You're not thinking clearly." I looked at him, and I tried to find the 12-year-old who had broken the window. I couldn't. That boy was gone. Something else was wearing his face. I said, "David, the realtor is not coming Thursday." His face went still, a different kind of still than before. "You heard that?" I did. "Mum, the buyer is not interested because the house is not for sale. The POA you submitted was not signed by me." "The bank has been notified. Martin has been notified. The social worker has been notified." Megan's coffee cup was shaking very slightly. She set it down before it could show her any further. I said, "I would like you both to leave now. I'll call you when I'm home and settled." They left. The next morning I was discharged. Frances, my neighbour, picked me up. She'd been called by Martin's office the night before and had driven to my house to check on it. She told me, in the car, that the front porch had 3 realtor lockboxes on the railing. 3. I asked her to take pictures. She already had. When we got to the house, I sat in the car for a moment before going in. The lawn had been mowed, which was strange, because I hadn't arranged for it. The mail slot had been taped shut. A small sign had been posted in the flower bed that read, "Coming soon," though the name of the realty company had been covered with a piece of painter's tape. The tape was peeling at one corner, lifting the way something does when it knows it isn't meant to last. I walked inside. The house smelled different. Not bad. Just not mine. The furniture had been rearranged. The dining room table was pushed against the wall. The china cabinet had been emptied, and I later learned the contents were in boxes in the garage, labelled in Megan's handwriting. Donate. Keep. Sell. My wedding photo, which had hung in the hallway for 38 years, was in the sell box. I stood there for a long time. I'm not sure how long. Long enough that the light in the window changed. Then I took the 3 documents out of my pocket and laid them on the kitchen counter, and I made myself a cup of tea. What happened next happened in 2 lanes, and I'll tell them the way they unfolded, which was simultaneously. On the financial side, Martin filed a formal revocation with the county recorder's office, along with a notice of fraudulent attempted conveyance. He flagged a specific clause under the state's Power of Attorney Act, one that provides that any person who knowingly uses a power of attorney not properly executed may be liable for damages, attorney's fees, and in some cases, criminal penalties. He also contacted my bank. A transaction review was opened. Within 48 hours, the bank identified a wire transfer attempt of $11,000 from my money market account, initiated the day before my hospital admission, that had been placed on hold pending signature verification. The signature, of course, had not matched. I remember reading that letter twice. Not because I didn't understand it, because I did. On the social side, Frances became my unofficial historian. She had lived across the street for 22 years. She had seen, over the past 3 days, a car she didn't recognize in my driveway, 2 men carrying boxes out of my garage, and Megan measuring the living room with a tape measure. She wrote it all down, dated and timed, because Frances is that kind of woman. Her husband, Jean, who is retired from the Naperville Police Department, helped her format it into a witness statement. I printed everything. I saved everything. I made 2 copies of each document and kept them in 2 different places, one at the house and one in Martin's office safe. Then I waited. David called on Saturday. His voice was different, not panicked yet. Performance was still running, but a little thinner at the edges. "Mom, I've been thinking. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Can Megan and I come over, just to talk?" "Not today." "Mom, David, the bank flagged a wire transfer from my account. Do you know anything about that?" A pause. A long one. "What wire transfer?" $11,000. "To an account I don't recognize." "I don't know what you're talking about." Okay, that was the end of the call. I set the phone down and looked at the kitchen window for a while. A cardinal was on the feeder. I watched it eat. On Monday, Martin received a letter from a lawyer I'd never heard of, representing David, proposing a family mediation to resolve the misunderstanding regarding Mrs. Halvorson's care and estate. Martin read it to me over the phone. I asked him what he recommended. He said, "I recommend we don't mediate. I recommend we respond with the documentation we already have and let them decide how much further they want to walk into this." That's what we did. On Wednesday, Frances came over with banana bread and news. The realty company, whose sign had been half covered in my flower bed, had called her, asking if she knew when the house would be ready for showings. Frances, bless her, had asked who had contracted them. The answer was David. The contract had been signed 2 days before my stroke. 2 days before. I sat with that for a while. The banana bread went cold on the plate. He hadn't been responding to my stroke. He had been preparing for it, or hoping for it, or something in between that I didn't want to name. That was the coldest moment of the whole thing. Not angry, cold. Like water at the bottom of a well. Martin added the realty contract to the file. He sent a cease and desist to the realty company, with a copy of the recorded revocation, and a note indicating that any further action on the property would be treated as a matter for the state's attorney's office. The realty company responded within the hour. The listing was withdrawn. The lockboxes were removed the next morning. I watched from the window while a young man in a polo shirt collected them off my porch railing. He waved at me politely. I waved back. He didn't know what he was carrying away. To him, it was just hardware. The social lane tightened next. Megan's sister, who I'd always liked, called me. She said she'd heard some things and wanted to check on me. I told her, calmly and without embellishment, what had happened. I didn't ask her to take sides. I just said, I wanted you to hear it from me. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I wondered if the line had dropped. Then she said, Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. That call made its way back to Megan within a day. I know because Megan sent me a long text message that evening, apologizing for any stress and saying she had only been trying to help. She did not mention the boxes in the garage. She did not mention the realtor. She did not mention the wire transfer. I didn't respond. Some apologies are just another kind of performance. The institutional tightening came the following Tuesday. I remember the day because it had rained all morning and then stopped, all at once, the way April rain does. The bank, having completed its internal review, sent a formal letter to David, informing him that the attempted wire transfer had been reversed, and that his access to any of my accounts, which he had apparently obtained months earlier, using a copy of my driver's license and a signature card that had never crossed my desk, had been revoked. The letter cited federal regulation and noted that the bank was required to report suspected elder financial exploitation to the state's Adult Protective Services Agency. That was the moment the tone changed. David called me that night. His voice was thin. The performance was gone. Mom, please. I'm going to lose my job if this gets reported. I said, I know. Can you tell them it was a misunderstanding? No, David. Mom, I'm not going to lie for you. I'm also not going to press charges. But I'm not going to lie, he cried. I listened. I did not cry with him. That may sound cold. It wasn't. It was just the shape my love had to take that night. And I think I'd known for a long time that this shape was coming. I just hadn't known what would trigger it. The Adult Protective Services report was filed. A caseworker came to my house the following week, a kind woman named Alicia, who asked careful questions and took notes in a spiral notebook. I can't remember if it was Tuesday or Wednesday. I remember she took her shoes off at the door without being asked, which felt like a small kindness. I showed her the documents. I showed her the photos Francis had taken. I showed her the boxes in the garage. She said, Mrs. Halvorsen, you've done something most people in your situation can't do. You kept records. I said, I'm a retired bookkeeper. I've been keeping records since 1968. She laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in 3 weeks. It surprised me, the sound of it, coming out of my own throat. The case was documented but not prosecuted, at my request. What I wanted was not punishment. What I wanted was a paper trail that would make this impossible to repeat. The caseworker understood. She filed everything with the state. She gave me her direct number. She said, if anything else happens, anything at all, call me first. I put her card in the drawer where Raymond used to keep his reading glasses. It felt like the right place for it. I haven't seen David since the hospital. That was 6 months ago now. He sent a letter in October, handwritten, 4 pages long. I read it twice. I put it in a folder with the other documents. I haven't written back yet. I might not. Some things you don't decide on a timeline. Megan filed for divorce in November. I was not surprised. Her sister sends me a Christmas card every year now. She signed this year's with just her name, no message. Some messages don't need words. The house is still mine. The furniture is back where it belongs. The wedding photo is back on the wall in the hallway, and I walk past it every morning on my way to make coffee. And I say good morning to Raymond, and I go about my day. I had the locks changed. I had a security system installed. I updated my will. Martin helped me set up a revocable trust, which makes things cleaner if anything happens to me in the future. I am not afraid of the future. I am prepared for it, which is a different thing. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. There will be more of them. Life has a way of providing material, especially when you've lived long enough to notice the patterns. I want to end with something I've been thinking about. In the evenings, when the house is quiet and the kettle is cooling on the stove, some people mistake stillness for absence. They see an older woman in a hospital bed, and they think the room is empty. They think decisions can be made around her, over her, through her. They think silence is the same thing as consent. It isn't. It never was. You can't take what was never yours to take. Not a house, not a signature. Not a life that still belongs, in every way that matters, to the person living it. The paperwork had my name on it, but the name and the signature are two different things. My son forgot that. The bank didn't. The notary didn't. Martin didn't. And, when it came down to it, neither did I. It's quiet here this morning. The kettle is on. The newspaper is on the table. Francis is coming over at 10. Outside, the maple in the front yard is turning, the way it does every April when the light finally warms up enough to mean it. I'm still here. I was always here.